Welcome, everyone. I'm Luna Goldberg, the Education Manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida-FIU. On behalf of the Jewish Museum and the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, it's my pleasure to welcome you to collecting, preserving, and sharing Jewish stories today. This evening's program is in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month and celebrates a milestone in the Jewish Museum of Florida's history. In 2006, President Bush proclaimed the month of May Jewish American Heritage Month as a result of joint efforts from the Jewish Museum of Florida, Florida Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and Pennsylvania Senator Arlen Specter. Over a decade later, JAHM has become an annual and nationwide celebration of the inspiring history and contributions of Jews in America. Tonight's event is especially exciting as it marks the public debut of the Jewish Museum's latest oral history campaign, Collecting These Times, American Jewish Experiences of the Pandemic, part of the Council of American Jewish Museums National Initiative. In celebration of this accomplishment, this evening will feature a short film and teaser for the collection, followed by a conversation with three distinguished panelists, Rebecca Bakker, Digital Collections Librarian at FIU, Dr. Rebecca Friedman, Founding Director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, and Alice Rubin, Project Director for Collecting These Times, all of whom I'll introduce more fully following the film. I also want to note that throughout tonight's program, members of the audience are encouraged to post questions for our speakers. And now I want to invite Alice Rubin to introduce and contextualize the project, Collecting These Times.
Thank you so much, Luna. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to start by actually thanking and drawing attention to the funder collaborative that made this project possible. And that collaborative was a group of funders that responded very rapidly during the onset of the pandemic to institutional needs, not just museums, but whether it was culture, education, a variety of areas to offer their support. Within that group, it was the Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah, Jim Joseph Foundation, Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family and the Russell Berry Foundation. And they've been incredibly supportive in helping us develop this program and responding to our needs and to the needs of our partners. So just briefly, this project actually came to fruition under the concept of Council of American Jewish Museum, or CAJM's, Executive Director Melissa Martins Yaverbaum, who's sorry she can't be here tonight. She and I have a long-term friendship and colleague relationship, having worked together for many years at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City originally. And we were discussing how would we capture and respond to the moment, again, very early on in the pandemic. And she understood that she had funds that could help support rapid collection. And we thought about it around oral history. At the same time, we had been presented, or her board had been presented with, a platform called Their Story, which allowed people, much like Zoom, to record conversations. The difference between Their Story and Zoom was it also allowed us to collect, catalog, and present the oral histories that we were interested in collecting. So we started that initiative within the first year, actually, by, I would say, June 2020. And we use that really as our grant application, which we knew already that the funders were interested in supporting. And out of that initial group of which Florida was one of them. They were there from the very beginning. We were able to expand to, depending on the part of the year, between 16 to 18 institutions, and collect over something like 3,000 oral histories. Really, the story of this is it started as a way to collect the experience in responding to COVID, and where we wound up 2 years later, and we are still collecting, really tells the story of the last 2 years, every twist and turn. So I think that really sets us up. And the only other thing to say is, with our partners, just to understand that these are museums and some social justice organizations. They span across America. And I know that some of our partners are here today, from Oregon, New York, Florida, the South, the Midwest, in Iowa, all over. So we really tried to make sure that we had a diverse group of museums, and that we were collecting diversely, that we were considering how to make a big tent of oral histories and bring everyone in and get different perspectives on the Jewish experience during the pandemic. So I would love to start us off and get us watching this wonderful video.
Wonderful. Okay, the last thing I will note is that these videos are thematic, and so the one that we're going to watch is actually around the theme of justice. With that, let me share my screen.
The pandemic really happened in a moment of like so many different social justice issues blowing up, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the anti-trans bills, the election. Like, there's just so many things that were happening simultaneously to the pandemic that the need for community only multiplied.
Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, it does not just apply for Jewish people. It's a responsibility we all have to stand up for those whose voices cannot be heard, for those whose voices were taken from them.
I think most of us would believe generally there's a problem in law enforcement. To hear about somebody pleading for his life.
And the images, the knee on the neck, I think, is just kind of, that's the takeaway from the whole, this whole period. That was a tipping point.
Of course, that was not something that anybody could rationalize or justify or look away from.
I grew up in a Miami that was very much like the South, was very segregated.
My husband was once pulled over by a Georgia state trooper and forced to strip down to his underwear on the side of the road. So we've ourselves experienced some of these moments.
And when we see these events happening, it's a reminder that really could be me. I can just be out for a run, and then suddenly I'm dead. And it felt so deeply personal.
Things and buildings, all of that can be broken down and can be recreated, and human lives cannot be taken for granted, cannot be taken without action.
First, you watch the protests, you watch what occurs, and there are moments where you're like, burn the whole thing down. That's what we deserve. Burn the whole thing down until something changes.
Well, we say as Jews, never again, and refer directly to the Holocaust. As Jews, we also refer to the general situation
And it's not going to be never again. And we need to keep protesting. We need to try to continue to try to raise people's understandings of human rights.
Because I think it's important that you don't just sort of show outrage or shock, but that you take action. And
oh my gosh, like now people on the streets, people are listening.
And so as Jews, I think it's really important for us to be aware about the forces that are working against us in society. But rather than having that turn us inward, I think it's essential that we continue to have allies and partners in working for justice for Jews and for others who have been marginalized and are vulnerable.
Really, really important. I think that people from both sides of the aisle try to find vehicles to come together to talk about the wrongs and talk about how can we make our community, our society better.
My hope is that, 20, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, when you're reading the history books about 2020, that it is a turning point.
Okay. So that was what will hopefully be one of multiple reels. And now I'd like to bring our panel up to continue the conversation. Wonderful. So I now want to welcome everyone. My first question is actually for you, Rebecca Friedman. Rebecca, you were actually the first person that we interviewed for this oral history campaign. And we took an interview, it was August 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you being on the other end?
Thank you, Luna. Yeah, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and thank you for inviting me to this panel tonight. I remember well what that was like for me. I mean, first of all, we at the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab also was trying to do its own work of recording what was going on in that moment, and we had asked people to write responses, so it wasn't oral history. So I was already kind of thinking a lot about the pandemic and its meaning by August 2020, but when you asked me to interview about how, and I remember about like the relationship between Jewishness and the pandemic, I panicked. Like I felt so nervous and so panicked, and I was like, what's the, like, how is there a relationship between Jewishness and the pandemic? It really stumped me. I don't know if that came across or not. I mean, I'm a very secular person. I'm sure I'm not the only one who was interviewed that's very secular. And so I remember thinking to myself, like, I have no idea. I don't know how my Jewishness relates to this experience at all. And so then when you had said you were going to ask this question, I started to think about what that means about oral history more generally, and how it's so important to think about the context, right, in which we are interviewing people, the context in which we're asking the questions to begin with, because I would have talked till my face was blue, or whatever the expression is, about the pandemic, but it was the Jewishness that got me, right? So it just made me think a lot about, because we do a lot of oral history, I know we'll be talking about that, about the context in which questions are asked, the context in which the conversations are had. I remember being able to say a lot about social justice, and I do connect that to my Judaism, I guess, but in retrospect, yes, but it wasn't obvious to me in that moment. So I guess that's really what I have to say. I appreciated the kind of food for thought, both about my relationship to Judaism and also about the meaning of oral history.
Amazing. Yeah, it is challenging. And I think, being on the other end, sometimes it feels very intrusive to ask these questions. And the way that you go about them, it really is an art that I don't think you ever get to mastering. So I appreciate hearing about your experience as well.
Thank you.
I also want to introduce Rebecca Bakker. Rebecca, you are involved in so many different aspects of oral histories, and so being at the digital collections at FIU, your role really moves into how we take these oral histories and make them accessible to the public. Can you tell us a little bit about this work and the importance of preserving these stories? And also, how are these stories used? How do they serve our community?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks again for having me. And thanks for doing this project. I'm typically a behind the scenes person, so the fact that I'm talking at all amazing, because but I was just so excited to talk about this because this really, to me, has been such a great project to be involved in. I do get involved in a lot of projects, mostly with like smaller archives or with students at FIU who are doing oral history projects. And I tend to be kind of the in-between person. So I help get them set up with equipment, I give them some best practices. They do the oral histories, they do the hard part that you guys have already done, but then I help a little with the post-production part of making sure that they're accessible, and that comes down to making sure there's transcripts and captions, and that we're doing long-term digital preservation, so that these can be available for many, many years for people, which was the whole point of this, right? You've done all this work, you want this to be accessible, we want everybody to hear these stories. And I think, as Rebecca just said, it serves the community in so many ways. I mean, I think anybody who participates in this comes away hopefully with a lot of meaning. This was during a time, I think, that we were very isolated from one another. So having an interview and introspection probably was really kind of nice, both for the interviewer and for the narrator and all the participants, but done in such a thoughtful way, right? This wasn't something where, I think people were probably very willing to give. But then ideally, and I think this is one of these ideal situations, it's going to live beyond the community. We're making this accessible. And in the archives, what we're really trying to do is make sure that we're expanding and broadening who's in the archive, whose stories are we capturing, who gets to hear these stories, are the everyday people, are we going to keep it with the power structure? And I mean, if you look at old archives, they kind of have the same sort of people in them. And this really broadens and opens that up. And oral histories are just so engaging to historians and researchers, kind of even opens up a new type of researcher, right? Somebody who might not want to go through old archives of papers might be willing to listen to these stories and thereby get some additional context for historical times. So that's what I have to say about it.
No, I love that. And I think that also rings true with what Alice said to get us started about starting this collection with intention and being very aware of who was represented. I know that at least for the Jewish Museum collection, we really tried to interview people both from the university community, working with students, working with staff, working with faculty, but also with people within the greater Miami area. And so how is life different when you're a clergy member or when you're the mayor overseeing a city? And all of those stories are so different that it's interesting to see them layered together. Alice, I want to return to you as someone who has seen many of these oral histories, not just here in Florida, but across the country. What are some of the emerging themes that you've noticed in the collection? And are there any stories or experiences that stand out to you or that touched you in particular?
Well, yes. All of the above. I was really thinking about, and I do think often, what are the themes? When we first started, what we were getting was Passover Zoom stories. And our seders and or illness, it was very, very focused on the onset of the virus itself. And then, what I also loved was there was a lot of humor. We would also get stories about, no one had toilet paper. It was the normal stories that everybody was experiencing through Jewish lens. And I think that, or I would say sometimes through a Jewish lens, really, I think Rebecca Friedman, your experience was often the experience we had of many. We really interviewed people across the spectrum, the big tent of Judaism. We had as I like to, the people who constantly question and say that they're not Jewish, therefore that's a very Jewish thing to do, to interviewing Haredi, really experiencing a great deal of virus infiltration throughout their community, and at the same time also experiencing anti-Semitism. So we really try to get as many diverse voices as possible. I think that we have, just to be quite honest, a lot to do with that, a lot more to do, especially in acknowledging and understanding the diversity of who is Jewish these days. One of the things, I learned in this process was that something like out of 10% of all American Jews are Jews of color. And that really started to shift perspective on what it meant and who was Jewish. So in general, I think that we got every story that anybody was going to tell. I did an interview very early on, of course, I'm personally, attached to, with a wonderful restaurateur in my neighborhood who owns a Jewish Montreal style deli called Mile End. And he was telling me that he had a son born in the very early stages. His wife had COVID. She was an emergency room doctor, but they escaped to Canada. They went into the hinterlands. His son was born and they couldn't find a moil. And he was not religious, but he said he was really feeling quite uncomfortable about his son not being circumcised. So I thought that was really, that conundrum of do we experience ritual in the middle of all of this was really great. And the truth is, what are the themes? The theme for me is often the same, which is how do we apply our values and our Jewish values to what we are experiencing throughout these last 2 years. Again, I just want to say that the shape of the interviews and what we were receiving followed the trajectory of what America has been going through, United States has been going through. There was the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the elections of 2020, the results of those elections. And, really the responses we got were, heartfelt, amazing, and reflect a society questioning where it is. And, really, as you were talking, I'll stop after this, but I'm really not and looking forward to our next round of oral histories where people may be responding to the recent leak from the Supreme Court and also the tragic events that have just happened out of Buffalo. These were both racially motivated, and the perpetrator was also espousing anti-Semitic beliefs. So I think that these are all part of the same, I don't know what it is, zeitgeist isn't the right word, but the same experience and the same moment in our culture. And we're responding to that and capturing that through these oral histories.
Thank you, Alice. I think I did listen to that oral history about not being able to find the moil, and it's it's wild to think about the moment. Also thinking about taking these oral histories over time, because when we started collecting, so the Jewish Museum, we started in August, and even then we were only a few months away from the election. And so it's really fascinating to see the shift in time and the way that people are considering these issues over 2 years because of that collection time period. And I have another question for Rebecca Friedman. So shortly after we began collecting these oral histories, the WPHL received a Mellon Foundation grant, which is actually going to allow the Jewish Museum to continue collecting oral histories as one of 8 community partners in a project called Community Data Curation, Preserving, Creating, and Narrating Everyday Stories. Can you tell us more about this project, why it's important, and a little bit about what you hope to capture with this program?
Thank you. So yeah, and basically we got the Public Humanities Lab, Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at FIU, got $1 million grant from the Mellon Foundation starting December 31st, 2020. A 3-year grant, which we will now push to 4 years because COVID. And basically that grant is meant to accomplish 2 things, at least, to digitize collections of the 8 partners, and I'll tell you who they are now, and also to collect oral histories. And the whole ethos of the grant, and I think why the Mellon Foundation was interested in the project, is because the way that we kind of crafted the idea is that it was really about leveraging all of the resources of the university in service of the community, which is really what the Public Humanities Lab is about. So we picked 8 institutions. Originally, they wanted us to do, I think, 12, and we're like, that's just too many. They're just 2 of us, like, ah! So we picked 8 institutions that were at very different stages in their kind of development, different sizes, represented different communities, different geographies, and so forth, in Greater Miami and Broward County. So mostly cultural institutions, and they include the Jewish Museum of Florida-FIU, the Museum of Graffiti in Wynwood, the Historic Hampton House. Let's see if I can do this. The African American Research Library and Center, I always get that wrong. Vizcaya, Sandlot Haitian Neighborhood Center, and what am I forgetting, people? Stonewall Art Museum and Archive, and also the World AIDS Museum. So those are our 8 partners in the grant. And so basically what Mellon wanted from us and what we're doing is, like I said, we're basically we hired 2 people. We hired a program manager and we hired a digital archivist. And so we also hired 8 student interns, each of whom works and is a liaison with each of the 8 institutions. I see one of them on this call. Hello. I'm like getting a lot of this from Anyway, so the idea is that the different cultural institutions themselves basically are in charge, which is to say they decide which parts of their collections they want digitized, what kind of oral history collection they want to build. And they also get to decide whether or not they want to share the data from the digital collections with FIU and put it on our system, dPanther. So it's really up to them, because the oral histories, there's an agreement that they will, since we're collecting them as part of the grant, be on dPanther as well as remain within the institutions. But so often these reflections, these relationships are kind of extractive in nature, right? Also like the kind of wham bam, thank you ma'am, one and done things, where you go in, you do what you got to do, and you come out and you're like, see you later, thanks for that. So the whole idea is to create like sustained relationships with these institutions, with these communities. So we are actually, part of the grant allows us to have the institutions purchase equipment, so that digitizing and oral history equipment, so that once the grant is done, they can continue working on these kinds of projects should they choose to do so. So there's a real kind of commitment to have sustained relationships and to allow the work to go on. I don't know if I've said enough or not, but I've said a lot. And also our hope is to create a network among those 8 institutions. And I think that's partly happened, and we need to do better and have more interactions, and we plan to do in the next couple of years, so that there's a kind of like sense of community among the institutions themselves, which are spread out, like I said, in Brown and Dade. I can say more, but I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So we're going to start taking questions from the audience, and I have a few to get us started. Feel free to also post them into the chat. So our first question is from Oren Steer, and he asks, is there any work being done to correlate different narrative themes with different temporal points over the course of the pandemic? For example, when did a specifically social justice oriented theme arise in the oral history, or when did social isolation specifically come up?
I'm going to jump in here and say that social isolation came up very quickly. In particular, we had one of our partners, and I'm sure there were many who did this, but in particular, Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles was interviewing survivors and or having young people interview elderly people. And so we had quite a few of the oral histories discuss social isolation. I think, you know, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg when it comes to social justice. Melissa and I were very anxious to make sure that that was included. We didn't necessarily have that from the very beginning, but quickly we added that into our please ask these questions or if it's relevant. So people were bringing it up, but at the same time, we were prompting people. We wanted to see if there was a response there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess to add in, also there were, again, with time, like further out we got from being in lockdown, those conversations started to change. Like initially people were talking about holidays and what it was like to not be able to gather. And later on, 2 years in, it was like, yeah, we're just doing a Zoom Seder. It became almost like something that there wasn't much to say about. So it's interesting to see how time also impacts how stories are told. And I wonder what it'd be like to hear, you know, stories from some of the earlier interviews 2 years out with that perspective.
Yeah, really. And I can tell you that stories did change the type of reflection we got, you know, being in the moment. Let's say, you know, early, whether that was March, April, May, June, to a year and a half later, and really reflecting back on their experiences and understanding it, and being able to have synthesized it over a number of months.
Thank you. We have another question from Susan Gladstone Pasternak, our executive director. And Susan asks, can you tell us what other themes you'll be exploring from these interviews? And so I think that's also maybe something that Rebecca, Alice, and I can speak to. Alice, do you want to maybe kick us off with what you're going to be collecting moving forward?
Yeah, moving forward, I think one, we're always going to be open to any story around the pandemic that people are interested in telling. We don't think that they've all been told, you know, and we know that people are living with long COVID and their experiences that we need to capture. We do want to continue with our work around diversity and equity, and capturing more stories in that with those themes. Anti-Semitism is incredibly important to us in capturing those stories. And then, you know, other things moving forward, I think we're going to see what develops. But in particular, we're really focusing on justice and diversity.
Thank you. Rebecca, do you want to speak to, I know we have a joint program that we're working towards. Do you want to share a little bit about that? Rebecca Friedman.
Oh, it's like, which Rebecca? I don't know what projects are going on. Do you mean the Mellon project? What you mean? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit about that. Ultimately, the way that the Mellon, like I said, the Mellon project is structured is it's really up to the Jewish Museum of Florida. How, is that what you mean? Is that what you're asking? How you want, you know, what the questions and the frame will be in terms of the interviews themselves? There were some ideas thrown around in the beginning that I could talk about if that's of interest.
Yeah, so I think connecting back to some of the themes that have come up in the oral histories, especially some of our later ones, being in Miami, something that came up quite a bit was the Surfside condo collapse.
Oh, that project.
So,
okay. Yes, sorry. So yeah, so we had talked about trying to do an oral history project with the survivors of the Surfside collapse. And as a matter of fact, had started doing that and had, of course, as you know, we did those interviews at the Jewish Museum. But one of the things that we realized is that a lot of the survivors feel that it's too soon to really have those stories taken, if you will, or given, I should say given, not taken, give those stories, provide and have those conversations. And also I think for practical reasons, because not all of the legal part of it is settled. And so I think there was also a feeling of protecting privacy and information and so forth until all of that is settled. So for the moment, that particular project is more or less on hold, although we absolutely must return to it, not only because of obviously the horrible tragedy, also because of the nature of that building and the community that was in the Jewish community and broader community that was in that building and what it represents about Miami itself. I really hope we will get the opportunity to capture that. Yeah.
absolutely. And we have another question. It hasn't come up for the Jewish Museum of Florida, but perhaps with other institutions. So this is a question around the Russian invasion of Ukraine and whether that has triggered Holocaust memories in elders when getting oral histories from elders.
I actually can, I'll defer to you guys first, but I have something to say about that from a totally different project, if it's of use.
Of course.
Should I go? Okay. So it's not actually oral histories, but we have a project that we're doing with poets. Basically, we have had a series of events with Ukrainian poets, both in the US and also, believe it or not, in Ukraine. We just did one with two poets in Ukraine. And the theme of it is war and women and gender. Anyway, so I met, through that project, I met a poet called Julia Dasbach, and Julia, who is herself Ukrainian Jewish. She was, she's born here, but her family's from Ukraine, and she's a poet. And so what she said, one of the interesting things that happened, since she's been very public about her support for Ukraine, she's done a lot of fundraising events and so forth, is the ways in which synagogues have become extremely interested in the work that she's doing, and that part of the conversations that go on in those, and it's not just support for the victims of war, that of course, but also that very comparison that our audience member asked about is this kind of the question of genocide has come up, right? Which maybe is a controversial one, but the kind of vehement way in which this war is taking place, and because of the part of the world in which it's taking place and all of that, that there are kind of comparisons being made, there are those questions being asked and so forth, which to me as a historian of that region is beyond fascinating, because of of knee-jerk feelings that lots of European Jews have about certain parts of the world. It's or knee-jerk or not, you know, that's a controversial thing to say too, but to me, it's like this kind of fascinating tragedy, but also in some ways, the notion that Holocaust survivors would embrace this cause, there's something also quite beautiful about that. So I guess I will end there on my random thoughts.
Alice, has it come up with other institutions? I know for us, we've stopped collecting before.
Yeah, so we've been in a holding pattern, and of course that holding pattern occurred with the onset of the invasion. It is something that we have been discussing and trying to respond appropriately. And part of that is, how do we respond appropriately? A lot of the work currently has been around documenting cultural heritage and the collections that exist currently in Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of energy, and there's also groups that are working very directly on gathering oral histories of Ukrainian Jews. But I love the idea, and hadn't thought of it, of reaching out to survivors, and particularly Ukrainian survivors in America, and getting their stories. So hopefully we can get up and running soon, and we'll be thinking about that.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So we have a little time left if anyone has any other questions, or I also want to open it up for panelists if you have any questions for each other. And while everyone is thinking, I also want to drop a link into the chat. So as Rebecca Friedman mentioned, we will soon begin collecting new oral histories at the Jewish Museum, and we are looking for participants who will be interested in sharing their stories. So you can complete this form if you're interested. It's very simple. It just asks for your name, your email address, contact info, and where you're based, so we can know whether this is something that can happen on site or virtually. But I encourage all of you to sign up. We would love to continue capturing these stories.
I have a question. I can always talk and ask a question, which is really of those who've been more involved in the JAHM project than I have. So one of the, and not really preoccupation seems a wrong word, but one of the kind of common themes of our oral history or oral history projects, other ones that we're doing at the Public Humanities Lab, has to do with the kind of share, whether we'll oral history is all about like the sharing of what you collect with the person from whom it's extracted, if you will, right? So I guess the narrator. So I wonder if you came across any of that in your, like a sense like, well, am I going to get this? I really want this. This is mine, not just yours. If those kinds of ethical questions came up at all in any of the project and during the kind of JAHM's project in any significant way.
I mean, JAHM is always looking, whether it's in oral histories or working with people in terms of what kind of ephemera and artifacts are out there, and how to then direct that to the proper museum or cultural organization. I should say that we had a different type of partner in collecting these times. The George Mason University, the Center for New Media, I have to get this for, and History, the Roy Rosenzweig Center for New Media and History, sorry, created a web portal so people could submit their materials, their Zoom seders, their pictures of people. And when we had those come up in the middle of the oral history, we most often directed it to them. Some museums we were working with were direct partners with George Mason, and they were also actively submitting materials and documentation to that. So that still exists today. And we can share that website as well, and that'll be ongoing. That is sort of in perpetuity. One of the things that we're trying to do with their story, which is the platform, the recording platform, is an ability to also document materials as they come up within the oral histories, because the oral histories are videos that we're doing, and have some sort of additional identification.
Great, thank you. If I'm not mistaken, we're going to be doing a history harvest with you guys, Linda, right? Which also kind of asks for ephemera and objects of meaning and all of that. So
we will. So, and we'll send information. We're planning for October 22, so a few months from now. So before we close, first I want to thank all of our panelists, Rebecca Bakker, Dr. Rebecca Friedman, and Alice Rubin for participating in this conversation. On behalf of the museum, I also want to express my gratitude to everyone who contributed to the collection, with special thanks to FIU students who worked on this initiative: Gabriela Acevedo, Leah Shaw, and Alejandro Gonzalez, as well as our FIU colleagues, Dr. Andrea Fanta, Rebecca Bakker, and Katie Coldiron for their support in recording and making these oral histories accessible. I am going to drop into the chat the link to the collections so that you can have access and watch these episodes in full if you're interested in them. And then I also have a few events that are coming up. So actually this Thursday at the Jewish Museum, we're having a wonderful opening named Giller on Giller, Adventures in Architecture. And this will be a really exciting show about the architects behind the MIMO architectural style. So you are invited and welcome to join us. And then our final event as part of Jewish American Heritage Month is actually a program around the Jewish history of Miami Beach with our walking tour guide, Howard Breyer. It's a very popular tour, and so for this program, he'll be sharing some secrets around that history, and I'll also drop that link in the chat for people in case they want to attend. And with that, I want to thank you all.
Thank you, Luna. There, perfect timing.
Thank you, Luna, and thank you for all the hard work for everybody. As someone who gets to see the final project, just to see the work that goes in, the narrators, the interviewers, it's all for a really, really great final project. I think it's really great.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Bye, everyone.